This next hour is going to be a lot of fun. I have a lot to share with you, and I'd love for it to be interactive. So if you want to turn your cameras on, please do. I'd love to see who's joining. Maybe say hi in the chat. Let me know where you're tuning in from. As I go through sharing some of my favorite products from Winsor Newton and working on the painting that I've prepared for you, I have a lot in store. So if you have questions, just like Annie said, pop them in the chat, interrupt me. I'm happy to answer questions as we go. And again, make this next hour an opportunity for you to just see what the process is, how I use watercolor, and some of my favorite products, as well as some beautiful new paints that we have that I'm about to share with you. So for those of you who aren't familiar with me, my name is Nicki Traikos. I'm best known, I guess, from my online classes, Watercolor Made Simple, and my new book of the same title. My approach to watercolor painting is just to make it really easy and enjoyable process and to have a little bit of success along the way as you go. If you are new to watercolor, maybe even let me know in the chat too, and I can kind of even gauge how much I share and even tips as we start to paint. I'm going to flip my camera just for a moment so you can see what we're working on, and then hopefully you'll have your page prepped as well so that you can paint along with me today. I should also mention that if you want to paint along and you're feeling like you can't keep up, because I will go a little bit quicker just so we can hopefully finish the piece within the hour. This session will be recorded. So Above Ground will have it on their YouTube channel. So you can go ahead and watch the replay anytime. And even if there is information that I shared that you didn't quite get, you'll be able to get that in the replay. Oh, welcome everyone. Rachel and Betty, thank you. Thanks for saying hey and letting me know you're here. Okay, so here's my desk. This is the piece that I decided we'd work on today. And via email, you should have gotten the line drawing so that you can trace the little botanical that we're working on. There's my tracing that I have ready to go. And hopefully you can follow along easily. The colors that I'm using today, and I'm going to start to swatch them and share them with you. They're a brand new set of colors that Winsor Newton is reviving. They are historical colors that Winsor Newton has matched that are inspired through their archives. They are vibrant. They are really pigmented. As you can see, I have them here pretty much neat. I haven't done a lot of color mixing on this piece, so you can really enjoy how vibrant the colors are. And then I brought in one color, Payne's Gray. If you're from my community, you know it's my favorite color from my set that I had the pleasure of doing with Winsor and Newton. It contains 6 of my go-to colors. Think of it, if you're stranded on a desert island, what colors would you want to have with you? Those are my colors. So I'll be using one from that set as well. And as well, I'll be showing you some brushes, the paper I'm working on, and even introduce you to a few mediums. So while I start to chat with you about products specifically, maybe if you didn't get a chance to go ahead and trace the botanical piece, do that now and settle in. Hopefully you have your watercolors ready as well, and we can do a little bit of painting. So what are watercolor paints? So watercolor paints are basically a water-soluble paint that is activated and reactivated using water. So most paints, or I would say all paints, consist of a pigment. So a color, that's your pigment here, and I'll show you close up as well. Color, and then a binder. In the case of watercolor, does anyone know what the binder is in watercolor paints? Maybe pop it in the chat and let me know if you know. So the binder basically is also water soluble and can be reactivated with water. And I don't see many answers. So it's actually gum arabic. So gum arabic comes from a tree. Yay, thank you, Carolyn. And then it is combined with the pigment. Maybe I will even do a little camera swap because it's really neat to see the process. So again, we have our pigment here in powder form and our gum arabic, which starts off as like a sap. So it's from the acacia tree. And when you add a little bit of water to it, it becomes sticky and it actually starts to even, you can move the gum arabic around. But the original form of this pigment prior to it being ground up like this actually comes from different sources. So it can be mineral. So exactly what I'm holding up here. And if anyone wants to take a guess to what this mineral stone is, pop it in the chat so I can see. So it'll often come from a form like this that may be mineral or something that is more organic. So this is roots that are then ground up and turned into this powder pigment, or it can be inorganic. So inorganic meaning it is synthetic. And when we use a synthetic start, yes, lapis lazuli. Amazing, Carolyn. Thank you. When we use a synthetic form, it usually is to replace something that is less sustainable. So when you have to take minerals like the lapis lazuli from the ground, that can be depleting. It can be found in areas of the world that maybe are a little bit unsafe, and also things that maybe are a bit toxic. And I'm going to talk to you about one of the paint colors in the revival set that I was really drawn to with the history of where they actually harvested the pigment from and what it's been replaced by. So I will share that. So this lapis lazuli is probably one of the more expensive forms of pigment. And I'm going to see if Carolyn knows or if anyone else knows, and it actually makes a color that we still use really often today in paints all over the spectrum, whether it's watercolor, oil, or acrylic. Does anyone want to guess what color lapis lazuli makes? Let's see if there's any answers before I share it. And I have a tube of it in my hand. So lapis lazuli turns into ultramarine blue. That's right. Thank you, Carolyn. So ultramarine blue is a color now that is in more of a synthetic form, so that, again, it's more sustainable and easier to harvest. So ultramarine blue is a staple in my watercolor kit as well. And that root that I showed you is actually rose madder root. So from the rose family, and then that's the rose madder color that you get, again, through a range of whether it's watercolor, oil, or acrylic as well. And because of the nature of watercolor paint, you would use water to activate and reactivate it. And I'm going to share with you, I think it'd be fun to put some color down and share with you what that looks like and what that process looks like. So I'm going to grab one of my pads of paper. And this paper is, there's a lot of information on a pad of paper if you take a look. This is a professional quality watercolor paper. It is hot pressed, which means has a smooth surface. It's 140 pounds and it's 100% cotton. So when you are looking for watercolor paper, those are the things that I would recommend you look for. If they check off all of the boxes with it being professional watercolor, 100% cotton and acid-free. It should say acid-free on the front here. If I can't see it, it's probably on the back. Then you know that your watercolor painting will last a long time. If you work on paper that is pulp base, you're not going to enjoy the process as much because the paint will fight against the surface of the paper, and it doesn't flow and move as easily. So what I'm going to do is just zoom in here a little bit so that you can see how I activate this watercolor. So I have a round brush, and I'll talk to you about brushes in a little bit. Let's use this purple color from our revival set. So I'm just adding a bit of water using my brush. I dispensed the watercolor pigment on my palette earlier so that I would save some time during the demo. And if you're working in this way, you can use a spray bottle. I love to just use a spray bottle, add a bit of water to my mix, and then just swirl that brush around. And watercolor brushes are made to absorb a lot of water, which means it absorbs a lot of paint so that when you go to paper, it can move that paint around and create a really beautiful, look at that pigment, beautiful flow of paint on your paper. So this color is from the Revival color set that I got to play around with, that we're featuring today. And this is Tyrian Purple. So again, think of these colors as part of the historical books that Winsor Newton keeps with all of their color mixes and pigments. But the pigment in this original Tyrian Purple was actually made by, and I wonder if anyone knows what sea animal it was made by. Any guesses? I'm going to check the chat here. Okay, maybe not yet. It's called the Murex. I wrote it down so I can pronounce it. The Murex sea snail. So it was a sea snail that basically exuded this yellow liquid and fluid, but when it hit the sun, it turned into a purple color. So that was harvested, and I can imagine them drying that purple fluid and then grinding it up into a pigment, similar to what I showed you with that ultramarine, and then turning it into a paint color. So pretty toxic. And of course, now with the more conscious and environmentally friendly version, we still get that really beautiful vibrancy, like I showed you swatching it, without sacrificing, again, the quality of the pigment that we get to work with. So when I'm looking for paints to use, there's a few things that I like to keep in mind, and there are really two qualities of watercolor paint within the Winsor and Newton line. There's professional, and that's what we're using today, as well as the Cotman. So the Cotman is the introductory range. Let's say the introductory level of watercolor pigment, and the professional is the higher quality. Now, what's the difference? There's a couple of differences that maybe you want to keep in mind as you're starting to grow your watercolor kit. The pigment, so that original pigment is what is the most expensive form within the paint tube. And there's a lot more pigment in the professional line. So the price is higher, but that pigment quality and that pigment payoff will be a lot more vibrant. So the opacity will be a lot deeper, and you'll see the effects of it when you start to mix it with other colors as well. Doesn't mean that these beginner sets aren't great or the beginner range isn't great. It just means that the pigment load isn't as high. And another difference, and I think this is important too, especially if maybe you're new to color mixing and relying on buying tubes of watercolor paint or wanting to get the new sets and the new colors that come out, is that within the professional range, you get a lot more options. There's a bigger range of color within the professional range than there is in the Cotman. So price point is different, the pigment load is different, and then the availability of colors is different as well. Okay, are there any questions before I go on to talk to you a little bit more about the pigment itself? I'm happy to answer a question if anyone has. If you're getting your palette set up, please let me know. Okay, all good, amazing. So some things to look at when you're looking at watercolor paints. So watercolor paint, I love painting with them. I'm a paper lover and I love the quality of just what the pigment looks like on paper. But based on, again, that starting point, so that original pigment, some watercolor paints will react differently when you put them on paper. Some will be staining. So when you try to lift them, and maybe we'll do a little demo as I share this bit. So when you try to lift the paint off the paper, so we'll go ahead, since this Tyrian purple is a little bit drier, I'm just using a wet brush and rubbing it across the paper to see how I can lift that paint. And it's not lifting easily, so that tells me that it is staining. So it's going to stain the paper a little bit. If I go to, let's demo Oswald Gray, and I'm going to use all these colors when we start painting, because this is a color that is actually really granulating. So if you're new again to watercolor, granulation means that the particles that make up that pigment, so remember that original powdery pigment, are a little bit larger. So you can see, and I'm going to zoom in even more, but you can see those little dots. Those are dots of granulation. And that's a really lovely effect in watercolor that I enjoy, because again, watercolor creates this beautiful texture, especially when dry, that only watercolor offers. It really is part of the charm and the character that I feel watercolor can create really easily without too much effort or effect on our part. So here is the yellow. Oh, my brush is dirty. Let's go ahead and reactivate. There's this yellow. So it's Orlean yellow hue. It's an alternative to a cobalt yellow, and it is really vibrant, really permanent, which I'll talk to you about in a second. And watered down, you get a beautiful glow yellow that offers you some, if you work on landscapes, just offers you a really nice, bright opportunity to create some beautiful landscapes. Now, when I talk about colors being, again, granulating, staining, or permanent, all of that information can be found on a tube. And when we think about the permanence of watercolor, again, professional watercolors are tested so that we can ensure that if you're painting on a painting and you're selling your paintings, perhaps, you want that painting to last a long time. And because we're using a water-soluble paint on paper, there's a lot of opportunity for that paint to fade if it's hung on a wall or in sunlight. So I'm going to suggest if you are painting using watercolor, please make sure that you use glass to frame your paintings and keep them away from direct sunlight. That will help them last and be more vibrant for a long period of time. But the beautiful thing is too, is Winsor Newton tests their professional watercolor range using what's called a blue wool test. And if you want to read up about a blue wool test, Google it. It's really interesting, actually. What they do is they want to see how fugitive a color is or how long that pigment lasts on a painting based on a controlled environment. So they'll look at what the environment in a museum is like. So controlled lighting, controlled heat, AC, all of that. And then they test to see if the color fades or not based on putting the pigment on a blue wool. So I'll do it this way so you can see, because I think it's good along my black. So all of these different wool dyes are then put in a machine, and that machine again mimics what 100 years of a piece hanging on a wall in a museum will look like. And you can see by the end of sort of this range, there's no pigment left. So here is the original pigment, and here is what the pigment looks like faded. So if I look at a tube of paint, maybe we can do this here so you can see that, there is a permanence of 2A, so a double A on this Orlean yellow. Let's go and zoom in for you, which means it'll be up here at the top range. So it's not fugitive. It's not going to fade over time, and it will last a long time. And that range, I typically see the permanence being anywhere from B to A to double A, which is really neat. And since I've zoomed in here, actually, the series number of paints just indicate how expensive the ingredient is, that main pigment ingredient in your paint. So a series 1 would be less expensive to a series 3 or 4. Okay. So again, there's a lot of information on a tube of paint. If you're wondering how the watercolor paint is going to behave, what it'll look like after a few years, and also, am I going to get some granulation or some staining in a watercolor piece, and how can I work with that within my painting? Now, for the most part, I like to use tubes. I work in studio, and if you want to paint even large, tubes are really great. I just, again, dispense just a little bit, maybe a bigger than a pea size on my palette. I can add a little bit of water and I'm ready to go. If you are traveling, so this pan came with me to France earlier, so it's a little bit dirty, but this is a professional field set. It is the same quality of pigment as the tubes of paints. You just need to activate them using a spray bottle. So I'm going to spray them. And then what I call is just give them a little wiggle to wake them up. So let's do that here so you can see what that looks like. And this is Winsor blue, so another one of my favorite blues, actually. And then you can see that pigment payoff. It's still really vibrant and beautiful. It's just a different form. So less gum arabic, and just requires a little bit more of waking up. But again, if you're traveling, these sets are the way to go. It's how I travel most often, so that I can take everything with me, which is really cool. Okay, so any questions about the paints before I start to move on a little bit? I'm going to rearrange my desk a slight bit so that you can see a little bit more about the paper as we go too. So when I was given, and go ahead, quick question, is there any type of fixative? Yeah, that's a really great question. Numa's asking if there's any type of fixative that can be used on watercolor painting to protect it before framing. So I use two methods. I will use a spray varnish. I personally like a matte varnish, so there isn't a sheen, and that just allows again, lighting not to reflect off of it, and it protects it. And then I just do 2 or 3 light coats, and I spray it outdoors so that just in case it's toxic and you don't want to be inhaling that. And I've been playing around with a cold wax that you apply, and you kind of want to be careful, like make sure you use a gloved hand. You can apply it directly with your hand, or I'll use an old hotel key card to apply it and just really smooth texture over top. It does create a bit of a sheen to your piece, so I would play around with either option and see what you prefer, but just a spray varnish works really well. You want to make sure you're not brushing a coating over top of your watercolor because it will move. Even if it doesn't reactivate the paint on your paper, it will move and smudge it slightly, and it becomes fuzzy. It's not a great option. So yeah, so try using a spray option so that you can seal your paintings and protect them. Okay, so a little bit more about paper. I showed you a hot press paper, which is smooth. It has a smooth finish. I'm going to show you some testing that I did with the colors and talk to you a little bit about cold press paper as well, and even some mediums. So I think, again, what I'll do is give myself some space. There's always so much to share during these, which are so fun. And I want to give you as much as I can so that you can have some fun with watercolor too. Okay, so I'm not sure if you can see this on camera as easily, but this side is my hot press paper using the Revival colors. I tend to mix more moody tones. And even when I was playing around with this new set, I'm going to show you some paintings that I did. It's fall. I'm looking outside and there are a ton of leaves that I'm going to have to rake this weekend, but I love fall scenes. So these are the Revival colors used in a different way. So this is a nice abstracted landscape. If you're coming in store with me tomorrow, I'm going to get you to test some paints and to play around with me. These are some pieces I'm going to paint. Oh, and this was even one of a flower that was in my garden. Again, playing around with the Revival colors, but trying to use them in different ways so that I could experience how to mix them together and what cool color mixes I could come up with. So cold press paper is what I'm going to be painting on today. It just means that there's a little bit of texture. And I like, again, the quality of seeing watercolor, what it looks like dry, and really enjoying that texture that I can create naturally. So smooth watercolor paper is an option. And then that's the hot pressed or cold pressed, which is a little bit of texture. And there are different amounts of texture. They can be fine. So this is a fine texture, but there's also ones that are very rough, which will give you, again, an opportunity for that granulation to really sink into the texture of the paper, which is neat. So two other things that I want to share with you. When I joined Winsor & Newton's education program just last year, I was really excited to find that there are mediums that I can mix into my watercolor paints to make the characteristic of the paint change. So again, when I think about pigment that maybe isn't granulating, but I like that texture to show up on my paper, there's actually fluids that you can use to add into your watercolor paint. And it's not something that I use in botanicals often, but if you have painted with acrylics, and has anyone paint usually with acrylics and are familiar with fluids and things that you can add to your paint? Let me know in the chat because I will be curious to know if you have experience with it. So I have painted with acrylics, and it's something I still do, but I didn't realize that that option was available again within watercolors. And I can create some beautiful texture and granulation using some of the mediums. Only in fabric medium, yes, with acrylic, yeah. So you're probably familiar, if you do have a bit of experience with acrylic painting, that you can add mediums to your paint in order to change the characteristic, the consistency, and how it behaves. So I really love two of them that I wanted to share with you. One is the granulation medium, just to make sure we're nice and focused here. And the other is texture medium. If you can join me in store tomorrow, first of all, I'd love to meet you in person. That would be great. But I would love to share with you more about how I use those two mediums. And basically, I pour a little bit. So I've got a little bit of that granulation medium just in an old jam jar. So keep the jam jars if you're traveling and getting a little sample, because they're great to pour your mediums in. And I apply them in two different ways. Let's go ahead and maybe we'll pick one of the greens. Let's do this Viridian hue. So this Viridian hue, I'm going to show you what it looks like swatched. Part of the Revival range. It's a beautiful green that has a blue undertone. Let me get nice and close so you can watch that color come to life. It is gorgeous and vibrant. So again, if you're doing botanicals or landscape paintings, this green can offer just that punchy vibrancy that's really beautiful, but it has a blue undertone. And sometimes it's hard to see the undertone unless you compare it to another color. So while I've got the green here, let's swatch this cinnabar green, which is a more vibrant, let's put it over here actually, vibrant, punchier green. It has lots of yellow undertone to it, which is beautiful. I'm going to add a bit of water so I can dilute that. Beautiful yellowish green undertones. Again, sort of the historical form of it back in the 18th century. Does come from the family of arsenic. So now that it is more friendly, environmentally friendly, and less toxic, we know that we can paint with it quite consistently or confidently, which is awesome. So what I can do with this medium, I can even apply this granulation medium right on top, and let's see what happens. And part of being an artist, we get to explore and be curious with processes and what we create. And I love just playing and figuring out, how can I use this medium and what does it look like at different stages? So if I were to add it wet onto the page, how does it behave and move? Make sure that I can get that in camera. Or what if I add it to the mix? I'm going to take a bit of that granulating medium, and I'll keep in mind that I've got the medium on my palette. So I've mixed it directly into my watercolor paint here. And let's see how much it granulates. And again, it's a really great thing to observe once it's dried. So this has the granulation medium mixed in, and this has it just mixed over top. And then what I'll do is maybe I'll let that dry, and we can take a look at it towards the end when it's fully dry, so that you can observe what the granulation looks like. I think I just called it texture medium because that's the other one I use. But you can see already how it's starting to break up that pigment and create a really nice, it's really effective there actually, a really nice granulation using a pigment that doesn't naturally granulate. So again, when we think about the qualities of the pigment and what they look like and how they behave, some of them can be staining. So remember, they stain the watercolor paper. Granulating, we just saw, as well as transparent. And you know what, before we move on, because we're going to start painting in a second, paints that are transparent, I'm going to show you within the Revival color, because this is actually a really neat connection to what we were looking at earlier. So remember this lapis lazuli that makes ultramarine blue? Well, there are lighter particles within this stone, and it actually makes ultramarine ash. So this color is a color that I used for skies most recently. It is a beautiful, misty, a blue tone. It's softly granulating, so it doesn't granulate a ton, but look at how transparent it is. So even the texture of working with this color is really beautiful. It's different than a color that might be a little bit more staining. And it has this translucency that, again, for skies, especially if you're painting moody skies, I really loved it when I got to play around and explore. So I thought that was really neat to be able to see the other components of the mineral formed into a pigment that creates this beautiful ultramarine ash from that historical range, which I think is really neat. Okay, so as I'm going to clear my desk, I'm going to chat with you a little bit about brushes, because I think brushes are the last of the tools that make the trifecta of your painting experience. And brushes can be sometimes a little bit more confusing for some who maybe don't know exactly what brushes they need, especially for watercolor and how they work. So I will let you know that I am using watercolor brushes that are 100% synthetic sable. So they're from Winsor Newton's Professional range. And they are not, so they are not made from animals. So they are 100% synthetic. but they behave like a real hair brush, which tends to be really expensive. And just even with the way that real hair, like Kolinsky brushes, are harvested, they're generally harvested in areas of the world that are maybe less safe. And even with climate change, the animals themselves are becoming more endangered. So it's, again, just a very environmentally protective and just more I can't think of the word, but a little bit more sustainable. That's the word. To, instead of having to harvest and using real hair brushes, which I appreciate. But again, the quality of the experience of painting is still there. So when you're using a paintbrush for, let's say, acrylics, we have an acrylic painter here, you want to look for a brush that is synthetic so that you can spread that acrylic-based paint, across your canvas. With watercolor, the character of the brush really comes down to how much water your brush holds, because the amount of water will dictate how much paint your brush can hold, and it'll dictate also how much movement you get on your paper when we start painting, which is going to be in 2 seconds. So if you are using watercolor brushes for any other types of paint, please don't. Reserve your watercolor brushes for your watercolor painting. Cleanup is really easy. I literally just swirl my brush into my water jar and I will lay them flat to dry on a paper towel. Doing so will ensure that the ferrule, so the part of the brush where the hairs are glued in, will be maintained, so the glue won't come undone and you won't lose any hairs. And if you take care of them, they will last a very long time. And I will say the size of brushes, I'm just going to clean one brush off here, really is determined by the size of painting that you're working on. I pulled a size 6, a size 4, and a size 2 round brush. With the round brushes, I have a lot of control, so I can create some bold strokes with the round brush, as well as nice thin. You can see how nice of a point I get here with a round brush. I did grab a number 1, so a size 1 is my smallest, only because I feel like there are some details that I want to be able to create with our painting and not have to struggle too much with doing that. Okay. So talk to you about a lot of things. So we talked about paint, paper, and brushes. Do you have any questions? Again, I'm just going to get my desk sorted so that we can start painting and enjoying some more of the revival colors and watching them come to life. So go ahead and ask in the comments if you have any questions while I get myself going here, and then we can get painting. Okay, awesome. And don't be afraid to ask me anything. I'm happy to answer about my process, about
Hey,
products.
I'm on direct messages, so it went to the wrong thing. Are brush sizes consistent across brands?
No, and that's a really great question. I don't know who's asking, but thank
It's
you.
Rachel.
Rachel, thank you. That's a really great question. And typically when I'm teaching lessons, I try not to even give the brush size, because a number 6 in a Winsor Newton will be different than a number 6 in a different brand. It's not like, I'm thinking of like lady shoes. It's not like lady shoes where that size is consistent. So if you can shop in store, so again, head to above ground and look at the actual size of the brush. And again, think about the size of the piece that you work on. I typically work on a 9x12. So this is from our block, our watercolor block, or even smaller, just because I like to paint within, a single setting. These size brushes work really well, especially for the fine, delicate detail. If I'm working on a piece that is a little bit bigger, I'm just going to grab my landscape here. Because I have washes of color, I'll use a bigger brush and even a flat brush to help me achieve that. So that way I'm not struggling and using a really small brush to fill a big space. So no, they're not the same size. And if you can shop in person, that's the best way to help you figure out what size you need. Maybe I'll go ahead and move that. So I see one more question. So Orlean yellow hue, is that the same as regular Orlean? So hue tends to mean that the color is pure, and the regular Orlean is probably not as pure, but you'll still get that same vibrancy. I can double check on that just to make sure, but yeah, that's usually the case. Thank you, Elise. So Carolyn's asking if you've used your palette, do you clean it up and start fresh? So no, and I actually did clean my palette today just so that it wouldn't be horribly dirty, but I typically let the tube paint color dry and then I just reactivate it using a bit of water. So it is meant to be used wet, but I seem to have no problem reactivating it. And in fact, I would save your palettes and make sure that you save your paint. So don't waste it by washing it down the sink because you can use it again and again. Think water activated and reactivated. Okay, so let's get started and I will zoom in at different points. I have the chat open so I can see your chats and questions or do what Rachel did and just unmute and let's chat. So I'm going to move a little bit quickly as well. Again, you can watch the repeat and the recording if you're having trouble following along. But what I typically like to do is sort of work left to right or look at sort of the bold florals within my piece. I'm actually going to have my piece handy so I know what colors I put where. And I say we start with that Tyrian purple because it is so bold and I want to be able to go in with it a little bit more opaquely. So remember, watercolor paint's activated with water. The way we lighten a color is not by using white. We use water to lighten it. So we create that transparency, lots of movement. And I think I'll start with a number 4 brush and see how it goes. So I like to use the tip of my brush to guide my edge to make sure I have a really nice clean edge. Let me get in nice and close so you can see that. And I'm just going to follow my pencil lines. And I'm okay with pencil lines. So if you're a little bit more bothered by having the pencil line show through, then just go ahead and use a kneaded eraser to lighten them slightly. But what I'm going to do is just follow the flow of these petals so that they flow into the center. And again, you can see how that pigment just bleeds into a wet stroke that's already on my paper. That is something that I really love about watercolor. It will move wherever there is wet. And again, turn your page if it's more comfortable. I don't like to make you dizzy on lives like this by turning my paper around, but using the edge of your brush can ensure a really nice clean edge. But look at that vibrant purple. So again, these brights aren't colors that I'm typically drawn to, but I so appreciate just how vibrant and beautiful these revival colors are. So that's that Tyrian purple. And then what I like to do, let's see if I can get my palette in there too. Here we go. I'm going to take a really nice opaque amount of color here. So again, it has a really high pigment load. And while this little beautiful floral is still wet, I'll drop it in and I'll create just a little bit more of a contrast here using that same color. Might even encourage it out a little bit. Okay, so the next floral I think that I'm going to paint, I think I'll go up here and we'll do these 2 flowers at the top. And this time I'm going to mix some of that Orlean yellow with this beautiful fields orange, orange color. So this is a historic color that was actually found in Queen Victoria's watercolor range. She was actually an avid watercolorist. I had the luxury of finding her sketchbook. It was at a vintage store in London. And it was a book on her sketchbook. Sorry, I'm mixing and I'm chatting. There we go, trying to get that yellow. And it was really fascinating to see just a historical account of her life with her fascination for sketching and watercolor painting as they traveled. And she's actually inspired one of our professional sable hair brushes, which is really neat. There we go. So I'm just using that Orlean yellow. And again, I want you to see how bright and opaque these colors are and really enjoy the vibrancy of this vintage inspired floral piece that I have so much fun painting. And again, just going to carefully follow my pencil lines, but then bring in this fields orange. So make sure you can see my palette. There's that really nice bright orange. So again, part of what's beautiful with watercolor is you can go ahead and work wet on wet and drop in pigment that will spread and activate and react to the color that it's being mixed with. And if I don't touch it, sometimes I want to move it around. That feathering that you see will continue to just spread slightly as the water starts to dry off your page, and interact with the yellow that's there as well. Okay, so let's paint this one a little bit less vibrant. So I'm just adding, and I'm just using my brush to do that. I'm just adding a little bit more water to the mix. And I think I will be even less careful or fussy with how I'm painting this one here, because I want this floral to be a little bit more transparent. So again, I lighten the watercolor paint using water, not white watercolor paint. It'll make it chalky if you use white. White watercolor paint does exist, but I really love that translucent effect that we get. And I'm just looking at my example. I think I'll take a little bit of that purple and just in the center, see it flow? So good. Just in the center, let it flow. And I'm even picking up a more opaque mix. And I really like that. So let's do it over here as well and see what happens. And again, the effects of the watercolor will change based on how wet your brush stroke is or how dry your paper is. So we can work wet on wet or dry on wet, or sorry, wet on dry, which is what we did when we started this purple flower here. But look at how vibrant and interesting that looks already. Okay. So let's move on to this flower, because again, it is one that stands out. And this time around, I'm just going to use water to, now my water is dirty because I have been swatching and showing you colors, but I'm just going to add water to my page. So a little bit harder to see because it's just water. Let's get in nice and close. And I'm going to go in first again with that yellow. So I want to keep my composition unified, and I'm just going to drop in some of that yellow. So even though I have pencil lines, I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to just let the water move, do its thing, and then I'll come in with a little bit of that orange and maybe even in between. So I'm painting it a little bit differently. We're exploring and having fun. So again, just with that fields orange and watching it move and flow. And I'll just encourage it a little bit and have the yellow and orange mixed together and see what happens. Okay, let's zoom out a bit and see how that's going. Great, it's coming to life already. It's amazing how fast that happens. So I think what I'll do now is I'm going to work, I'll leave this little guy for the end, but I'm going to work again, top to bottom, and let's explore and play around with using the yellow, the Orlean yellow as our base for these leaves and showing you how I like to mix two colors together, but I do color mixing on the page here. Zoom in again, and I'm making sure that my yellow has quite a bit of water, because I want the colors to mix on the page, and I have studio lights on, so it's a little bit warmer in here. It'll dry quicker, so I'm going to move a little bit more quickly, putting this yellow down. And again, it doesn't have to be, you don't have to worry about staying in the lines or having it be perfect. This piece can be your experiment. It can be the first time that you're painting it. And then let's grab the cinnabar green. So the cinnabar green, again, has a yellow undertone. And I want there to be a little bit of fluid. So I just added a bit more water on my brush. I want there to be a little bit of fluid movement. And then again, I'm just going to drop in the green and I'll let it react to what's happening on my page already. And give it a moment. You can see it starting to bleed. And because there's already a yellow undertone within that cinnabar green, I know that it's going to mix really well with that yellow to create that punchy. You can see how really nice and punchy that green is. And then what I do with a drier brush, so I typically, you can probably hear me swirling it into my water jar. I typically swirl to clean and then just dab off the excess water on a paper towel so that I can come back in and blend it around. And at this point, I'm just experimenting. I want to see how the colors look together, how vibrant they are. Maybe I will move this one around a little bit. Ooh, I even like how that yellow is popped through. So the green sort of is just staining that yellow, creating a little bit of a glow underneath. And I really like that vibrancy. So if I pull away, again, you can see just how beautiful and bold and vibrant those colors are. Oh, I love that Tyrian purple. I don't paint with the violet tones very often, but when I do, I keep reminding myself that I probably should. I should use them more. So next up, let's use the Viridian hue. So remember, it's that transparent green. It has a little bit of blue undertone. It's very similar to a genuine Viridian, and I'm going to use it very boldly. So different than what I had in my sample, but I want you to see as it begins to lighten up how really it's almost like a tealy green compared to the cinnabar green that we used above. So again, relative, when you can see colors sort of close to each other, maybe it's easier for you to see undertones if that's something that you're maybe still learning about or even working into your own work. Undertones are always a little bit easier to see when they are next to a similar color with a different undertone. And if we have time at the end, I'll show you how I swatch my colors. That helps me see undertones really easily. So I'm going to put just water on my brush. So I'm going down the stem here, still using that beautiful Viridian hue. And by adding more water, I can lighten up that color really easily. Just pulling it down. And again, when you're working with watercolor on paper with your brush, you can pull down that wet bead. It will help you create a really nice, consistent stroke. I'll get it nice and close so you can see that again. So I'm going to take a bit of that pigment on my brush, start by pulling that wet bead across, and then moving the wet bead down where I want it to go. And that again will help me create that really nice, consistent flow. But I do want it to be lighter, so I'll add a bit of water to my brush. Pulling that down. And at this point, what I could do, oh, I really like how nice and deep that is instead of dropping in a more opaque version of that Viridian color, let's go ahead and add, I'm thinking this Otswald's gray. No, I'm changing my mind. We're going to use this color here, which I haven't talked to you about. It's mineral gray. Again, it's a semi-transparent color, but I almost want to see if I can tone this green a little bit. I'll dab off a slight bit here. So let me show you that color again. So it's Otswald's gray. And then zoom in. And I do see a question coming in, so I will take a break so you can maybe catch up a little bit. But I'm just going to go in and maybe draw in where the stems or that shadow will go. So the Otswald's gray will create just a little bit of toning. You'll see it more here because the color is lighter. A little bit of toning and offer a little bit of shadow. And while watercolor is wet, you are in control still. So you can move that paint around. And that's what I will do to clean it up. And even pull it across a little bit. And again, just so the leaves aren't completely flat, I will move them around and pull in that transparent gray a little bit, which is really neat. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there just in case you're following along and want to catch up and answer a question. So Elise is asking if I usually draw before I paint. So the answer is typically yes, if I'm working on a piece like this where I want to make sure the composition of the flowers is really cohesive and it flows nicely. If I'm working on a landscape, I will draw in, I'll draw in just my horizon lines, and then any, like the path was drawn in, and I'll actually be painting this one tomorrow. And I'll use pencil lines sort of just again to give me guides, and then everything else will be just by eye and it'll be free flowing. So sometimes when I paint loose florals, I won't draw in just a really rough sketch. I'll go loosely and just let the watercolor flow. If you're starting out, creating a pencil drawing will be really helpful so that again you can sort of train your eye compositionally where you want things to go. I say play around with it too, but typically I do have pencil lines.
Have you ever sketched in with watercolor pencils?
Yes, yes, I do. And watercolor pencils are great because if you don't like the graphite sort of that's left on the paper, watercolor pencil tends to become part of the piece. So it will start to be a little bit more transparent. So I would use watercolor pencils that are similar in the colors that you're using within your piece as well. Yeah, and Winsor Newton has a great range of watercolor pencil sets too, if you need some to explore. Thank you, Shelley and Lise. Okay, so I'm just being cognizant of the time. Let's go ahead and continue to work. And again, I'm going to work a little bit more quickly. Let's get in nice and close for you too, so we can at least finish up the majority. And I can share with you Payne's Gray, which again is for my set, which is a color that I like to use in the center of flowers just to make them pop ever so slightly. So let's use that Viridian green again. And then I'm going to use it neat, but really light. And I've changed brushes. So it's, I'm going to change brushes so that I don't worry too much about. And I didn't tell you when I changed brushes, apologies. But again, I kind of look at how small the space is. And if I need to get in a little bit more tightly, I will go down a brush size. And again, just looking at the amount of water on my brush versus what is on the palette. And even looking at this stem on its own, I like that there's variation with the different levels of pigment within the leaves too. It just creates an interesting finish when everything is dry. But for this last stem, let's add an interesting color mix. So I'm going to pull back a little bit so you can see that. So these grays within the Revival colors, I really enjoyed. And again, when I was color mixing and thinking about how I would use them, I was studying what the Ostwald's, probably pronouncing that wrong, Ostwald's gray with all the granulation. But then I was thinking about how I could tone colors. So the grays within this range is a really great way for you to tone something like Fields Orange that's really punchy. If I added a little bit of Ostwald's gray and mixed it together, I got this beautiful rusty color, which really inspired me to try painting a floral. This is a zinnia from my garden that was dying, but I love just that burnt orange. So this is, again, you can see my color mixing here, a little bit of the Aurelian hue as my base to give me that brightness, mixed in with the Fields Orange, and then a little bit of that Ostwald's gray to tone it to make it a bit more muted. So let's see what that looks like with this punchy Viridian green. So if I take a bit of that Viridian green, so I like to make myself a clean little pile there, and some of this Ostwald's gray, mix it together. What kind of green am I going to get? So let's get in nice and close. And I'm going to just go for it. I usually swatch on just a scrap piece of watercolor paper, but I'm just going to go for it in this case. So you can see how really nice and it's like a forest green. I'm even going to change brushes actually. So I'll go back to my number 4. It creates a really beautiful forest green. So if you're into more deeper tones, you can use the grays within the Revival set to tone your paints so that you can color mix more muted, what I like to call as deeper tones. And again, these are colors that I gravitate towards when I'm doing things like landscapes, when I want something that's a little bit less bright. Again, just pulling that water color bead. And I can even go back and maybe mix a deeper, see if I can get that in there. Perfect. You can see how messy I get when I'm color mixing. I feel like, again, the process, it's organic. It depends on how you like to work. But when I'm working with a palette of colors and I know I'm mixing them all together, it just creates that cohesive feel in a painting too, which I really like. I'm going to try to do this with a number 4 brush, just so I don't have to wash off my brush. Perfect. Okay, let's zoom out. Let's paint the little dragonfly quickly. And then as I'm finishing up, if you have questions, feel free to unmute and let me know while we just do the finishing touches. So again, I'm going to pick up that mineral gray and use the mineral gray. Maybe I will turn my page around just so I don't get my hand in the wet paint. And I will use the mineral gray to paint the wings of this sweet little dragonfly. And because it is a semi-transparent color, I'm going to go in with a little bit of water. Oh, maybe a little too much water, just to make it look like the wings of the dragonfly are nice and transparent. And then in contrast to the wings, I like to use that Viridian hue. And I think what I'll do is I will bring it down the entire body, let it dry. Oh, I even like how that has bled. So remember, watercolor when wet, it will move wherever there is wet. So I did touch it slightly on the wing, but I actually really like how that's bleeding a slight bit. So I'm going to now on purpose do that. But I'll let that dry fully. And then here comes my Payne's Gray that I love so much. Again, if you're in my community, you know Payne's Gray is probably one of my favorite colors, but it's this inky, oh, make sure you can see it on camera here. It's this inky bluish gray. It's a really nice deep color. So it's more dark than an indigo, let's say, but it is a really beautiful deep tone that I'll use in the flowers as well. So we'll bring that in. Actually, while I have it on my brush, let's see what happens, how it behaves wet on wet with the Viridian. And we'll just let it bleed and see what happens. And this is actually a color that I use too if I want to tone as well, the Payne's Gray, which is really fun. There we go. He came to life pretty quickly. And so I'm looking at how that Viridian is flowing into the mineral gray. And I'm just going to use a clean brush and encourage it to go back. So picking up a bit of that wet, and I'm going to even blend it underneath. So remember, while your watercolor is still wet, you have control. You can move things around and encourage them. Oh, we're almost there. Okay. Stick with me. Let's stay together for just a few more minutes. Anna, I hope we're good to stay on for another 2 minutes. I'm just going to go ahead and quickly finish. This was an ambitious piece, but I think it was really fun to paint. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you're able to join me in store tomorrow, we do have some dot cards that we're going to be giving. I'll get you to paint with me. You can try the, ooh, I'm talking now, I'm painting that orange part. I'll get you to paint with me. So come and join me in store and try out the different mediums that I have that I'm going to be working with. And yeah, chat. We can talk about art supplies and technique. And now that I'm in the most fussiest part, I'm going to try to do this as quickly as possible. Does anyone have questions to wrap up or to ask me as we wrap up while I work on these little fine stems? Pop them in the chat. Oh, Karen lives in Ottawa. Well, I'm glad you could join virtually. How awesome is that? But if you are in Toronto, come say hi. Okay, Maybe we'll do one more because I feel like that finishes it. You can see the pencil lines. What I'm going to do is just show you sort of my finishing touch. I use Payne's Gray typically to just go into the center of my flowers. It just creates a little bit more depth. So it's kind of like how I use black when I'm painting using acrylic paint. I can even create some interesting dots here. I feel like it just grounds a painting. So that Payne's Gray does that really effortlessly for me. And then I can even go to this one here and just enhance. So see how it just creates a little bit of punchiness. One last thing that I will do before we say goodbye is just connect these little stamen fun bits to the flower. Okay, let's zoom out and see how that looks. So there we go. So that is our vintage inspired botanical piece using Winsor Newton's Revival colors. They are available in store. If you enjoyed painting with me, please go ahead and tag me. Let me know that you did paint. Follow along Winsor Newton on Instagram. They also have a really great newsletter that they put out where they share interesting facts around all of sort of the historical components when it comes to pigments and the archives that Winsor Newton has access to from how pigments were created and paints were created back in the day. So make sure you do subscribe to them so you can get those newsletters. Thank you to Above Ground for having me demo today. I'm really excited to be in the store tomorrow. And of course to Winsor Newton for having me be able to paint with you and share my love for watercolor and some of my favorite products and tools that I get to use in studio. So again, thank you. You've been really fun and I had a lot of fun and we'll see you in store.